I'm just very quickly going to go through the mesh method. And once you see how to set it up, pretty much you can solve it and use it. It's up to you whether if you understand the concept and want to use it, that's fine. The first step with mesh, of course, I already put my polarities in for my batteries. The idea behind mesh method is you have what are called loop currents. Now these really don't exist. It's a theoretical construct that lets us kind of simplify some things. So our first loop current, we're going to say, goes around this loop here, and we'll call that loop current I1. The second loop current is in the middle, and we'll call that I2. And the third is on the other side of the circuit, and we'll call that I3. Now, based on the loop currents, we're going to write our polarities. And so in this case, we have plus on the left, minus on the right for resistor R1, because of the way we have our loops. And you notice the loops go in the same direction. They're all in the clockwise direction. Now for R2, it's going to be positive on the left, negative on the right. And for R3, it's going to be positive on the left, negative on the right. Now for loop current 1, we have for R4, it's going to be positive on the top, negative on the bottom. But look, for loop current 2, we're going to have a polarity of positive on the bottom, negative on top. And the same with R5, it's going to be positive on the top, negative on the bottom for I2. For current I3, it's going to be positive on the bottom, negative on the top. Now, to write these equations very quickly, you could go through and do a nodal or do a branch method. You'd have to take into account both currents going through these resistors. But just to kind of give you an idea, what you would do is I would take and write my loop current that I'm interested in. So this is loop 1. So I'd have I1, and I'm going to add the resistors around this loop going in that direction. So I'm going to have R1 plus R4, and then I'm going to subtract any loop that's connected to it, in this case I2, and the resistor is R4. So that's the one common resistor between loop 1 and loop 2. And that's going to have to equal all the sum of the batteries around this loop. So I'm going to start with this loop, and I go from minus to plus, so I'm going to have equal to V1, and there's no other batteries in this loop. Okay, now for loop 2, I'm going to have I2 times and all the resistors that touch it. So I'm going to have R2 plus R4 plus R5, subtract the common resistors. So I'm going to have minus I1 R4 minus I3 R5, and that's going to equal, well, there's no potentials in this, no potential sources in this loop, so it's going to be equals to 0 volts. Now I can rearrange this because I want to be able to solve this, so I'm going to have, for simultaneous equations, I'm going to have minus I1 R4 plus I2, R2 plus R4 plus R5 minus I3 R5 equals 0 volts. And for loop 3, I take and say, well, I have I3 times, and I have R5 and R3 connected, minus, and the only loop that it's sharing is with loop 2, and I'm going to have R5 as the common, and that's going to equal, and I go around the loop in a clockwise direction, and I get to this voltage source, V2, and I have to jump over, and it's going to be equal to a negative V2. Rearrange these so that I have it in multiple equation, multiple variable form. And so I'm going to have negative I2 R5 plus I3 R3 plus R5 is equal to negative V2. I now have three equations, three unknowns. My unknowns I1, I2, and I3. Now I can solve for those loop currents. And now, once I solve for I1, I2, and I3, I know that IR1 is equal to I1, IR2 is equal to I2, and IR3 is equal to I3, and then I'm going to have IR4 is going to be equal to, well, I have I1, and that loop current is opposed by loop current I2. And for IR5, I have I2 minus I3. And then once I have that, I know VR1 is equal to IR1 R1. VR2 is equal to IR2 times R2. VR3 is equal to IR3 R3. VR4 is equal to IR4 R4, and VR5 is, last but not least, IR5 times R5. So mesh is nice because it reduces the number of equations. It's very quick that you can come up with these equations just by looking at it. You can just blow these equations out, get them done, and then solve for the variables that you need.